On the cold night of January 21st, 1959, the most recognizable face of American childhood bled to death on a stranger's dirty floor. Carl "Alfalfa" Switzer was the million-dollar boy who built an empire on laughter, the innocent crooner whose cowlick defied gravity and charmed a generation. But at 31, he didn't die a legend in a Beverly Hills mansion. He died a broke, desperate man shot in the stomach over a petty dispute involving a hunting dog and a debt of just $50. The industry that harvested his youth for millions never taught him how to survive the silence when the laughter stopped, leaving him to face a dark, violent fate that was cheaper than the film stock he was printed on. But to unravel the grim arithmetic of how a cultural icon ends up dying for the price of a few tanks of gas, we must peel back the layers of nostalgia to reveal the ruthless machinery of the Golden Age. The tragedy of Carl Switzer did not begin with the bullet. It began the moment he learned that his value as a human being was tied entirely to his ability to act like a fool. The story starts in the dusty reality of the Great Depression. While the rest of America stood in breadlines, staring into a bleak future, Hollywood was in the business of selling distractions. In the mid-1930s, the Hal Roach Studios was looking for gold, but they didn't want polished, theatrical children who could tap dance or recite Shakespeare. They wanted raw, unvarnished humanity. They wanted missing teeth, scuffed knees, and hair that refused to obey the laws of physics. In 1934, the Switzer family arrived in California from Paris, Illinois, chasing the same mirage that drew thousands of desperate families west. The legend of their audition is a testament to the chaotic energy that would define Carl's life. The Switzer boys didn't wait for an appointment. They reportedly broke into the studio commissary, jumped onto a table, and began to sing. They were loud, off-key, and absolutely fearless. Hal Roach, the king of comedy, didn't see a nuisance. He saw a star. Carl was cast as Alfalfa in our gang, later known to the world as the Little Rascals. Almost overnight, he became the anchor of the franchise. He was the eternal optimist, the lover who couldn't woo, the singer who couldn't carry a tune. He was a master of physical comedy, a skinny kid in a suit that was always too small, with a face that could contort into a roadmap of innocent misery. For 5 years, he was the most famous child in America. His face was on lunchboxes, comic books, and movie posters. But there is a toxicity inherent in the contract between a child star and the audience. The public falls in love with a frozen moment in time. They loved Alfalfa because he was safe, awkward, and effectively sexless. But Carl Switzer was a human boy growing up in a pressure cooker. Behind the scenes, the angelic Alfalfa was known as a terror. He was difficult, prone to cruel pranks, and increasingly bitter. He would put fish hooks in people's pockets and sabotage takes. It was the acting out of a child who was being robbed of a normal life, forced to perform joy on command for 8 hours a day while supporting his entire family. To the audience sitting in darkened theaters across America, the Little Rascals offered a window into an idyllic, consequence-free childhood that the Depression had stolen from them. Alfalfa was the patron saint of the lovable loser. He was the boy who tried too hard, the romantic who slicked down his hair with axle grease only to have the cowlick pop back up at the worst possible moment. When he opened his mouth to croon, "I'm in the mood for love," his voice cracking and sliding off key, it wasn't just funny. It was a symphony of awkwardness that everyone recognized. He was valid because he was imperfect. But validation is a dangerous drug when it is dispensed by a movie studio. Hal Roach and later MGM didn't view Carl Switzer as a prodigy to be nurtured. They viewed him as an asset to be mined. In the 1930s, the laws protecting child actors were primitive, more suggestion than statute. The famous Coogan Law, designed to protect a child's earnings from greedy parents, was in its infancy and full of loopholes. Carl was generating a fortune, but the money flowed upstream. It went to the studio, to the agents, and to his parents, who were suddenly living the Hollywood lifestyle on their son's back. Carl was merely the engine, and engines are run until they seize. Life on the lot was a bizarre existence. He was surrounded by other children, Spanky, Darla, Buckwheat, but they were not friends in the traditional sense. They were co-workers in a high-stress environment. The competition was fierce. Screen time was currency. If you weren't funny, you didn't eat. Carl learned early on that attention was the only thing that mattered. If he couldn't get it by being good, he would get it by being bad. The stories of his on-set behavior are legendary and troubling. He would hide rocks in snowballs. He would put gum in the camera lenses. He was fighting for control in a world where he had none. The adults laughed it off as high spirits, but in retrospect, it was the screaming of a child who was being commodified. As the late 1930s rolled on, the studio began to extract every ounce of Alfalfa's marketability. They put him on tours, they put him in advertisements, they had him shaking hands with dignitaries. He was a miniature diplomat for the brand of happiness. But inside the boy, a resentment was growing. He was smart enough to see the transaction. He saw the executives in their suits driving expensive cars, bought with the laughs he generated by falling into mud puddles. He began to develop a hard shell, a cynicism that sat uncomfortably on his freckled face. He wasn't just Alfalfa. He was becoming a prisoner of Alfalfa. The cruelty of his fame was that it was entirely dependent on his physical appearance. He was funny because he looked funny, but nature is the enemy of the child star. As 1940 approached, Carl was 12 years old. The biological clock was ticking loudly. His limbs were getting too long for the short pants. The baby fat was melting away to reveal the sharp angles of a young man. The voice, his trademark instrument of torture, was changing. It wasn't cracking comedically anymore. It was deepening. The squeak was gone. Hal Roach sold the rights to Our Gang to MGM, and the tone of the series shifted. It became more moralizing, less anarchic. The fun was being drained out of it. And so was Carl's utility. The studio executives watched the dailies with a critical eye. They didn't see a young actor developing his craft. They saw a product reaching its expiration date. In the brutal calculus of Hollywood, a cute kid is a gold mine, but an awkward teenager is a liability. They didn't have a plan for Alfalfa to grow up. Alfalfa wasn't supposed to grow up. He was supposed to stay 12 forever. The dismissal, when it came, was not a dramatic firing. It was a slow freeze. The script started giving him fewer lines. The camera started focusing on the younger, cuter kids. And then, unceremoniously, it was over. At age 12, Carl Switzer was retired. He was a has-been before he was old enough to drive. For a normal child, 12 is the beginning of life. For Carl Switzer, it was the end of his identity. He walked off the MGM lot with no severance package, no residuals, and no guidance. He had spent his formative years learning how to mug for a camera, how to take a pratfall, how to be a caricature. He had not learned math or history or how to function in a society that didn't applaud when he entered a room. He was thrust back into the real world, but he was an alien there. He was Alfalfa. Everywhere he went, people pointed. They expected him to sing. They expected the cow lick. When they saw a moody, confused teenager instead, they were disappointed and Carl felt that disappointment like a physical blow. The transition from little rascal to unemployed actor was jarring. His parents, who had grown accustomed to the income, pushed him to find more work, but the phone wasn't ringing. The typecasting was absolute. No producer wanted to hire Alfalfa to play a serious role. It would ruin the scene. Imagine trying to cast him as a dramatic lead. The moment he walked on screen, the audience would giggle. He was branded. The face that had made him rich was now the wall standing between him and his future. He tried to pivot. He took small roles in B-movies, often playing the bully or the nuisance, a dark reflection of his former self. He was casting about for a new identity, but the shadow of Alfalfa was long and suffocating. He began to frequent the local haunts of Hollywood, drinking with older actors, trying to buy his way into the fraternity of men. He wanted to be respected as a tough guy, perhaps to compensate for the years of being the sissy in the suit. He started carrying himself with a swagger that didn't quite fit. He bought a hunting dog, he bought guns, he started crafting a persona of the outdoorsman, the rugged individualist. It was a role he cast himself in, one where he didn't have to sing, and one where he carried a weapon instead of a tune. But the money was running out. The fortune that had been amassed during the Our Gang years had evaporated. The lifestyle had eaten it. The taxes had eaten it. The mismanagement had eaten it. By the time he was 16, Carl Switzer was facing a terrifying reality. He was a celebrity who was broke. He had the recognition of a president and the bank account of a pauper. This cognitive dissonance, being famous but destitute, is a specific kind of psychological torture. It breeds a deep, simmering anger. You feel like the world owes you something because you gave it your childhood, and it gave you nothing back but a nickname you couldn't shake. As the 1940s progressed, Carl drifted further from the center of the industry. He was still in Hollywood, hovering like a moth around a light that had been turned off. He watched as new stars rose, stars who were allowed to be beautiful, serious, and adult. He watched the machinery that had chewed him up move on to fresh meat, and deep down, the resentment began to curdle into something dangerous. He wasn't just a sad story, he was a ticking bomb. The boy who had charmed the world was gone, replaced by a young man with a chip on his shoulder and a growing desperation to prove that he was more than a joke. The stage was set for a second act that would be defined not by comedy, but by a gritty, humiliating struggle for survival. By 1946, Carl Switzer was 20 years old, and the doors of Hollywood were not just closed, they were bolted shut. The boy who had been the face of our gang was now a young man haunting the fringes of the industry, a ghost in the machine that had created him. He had height, he had experience, but he carried the heavy baggage of a caricature. Producers didn't see an actor, they saw a visual punchline. They saw the cowlick even when he slicked his hair back. They heard the crack in his voice even when he spoke in a measured baritone. He was trapped in the purgatory of the has-been, a cruel state of existence where you are famous enough to be recognized by everyone on the street, but not respected enough to be hired for a job that pays a living wage. The adoration of the fans had turned into a kind of pitying curiosity. "Hey, look, it's Alfalfa," they would shout, pointing at him as he pumped gas or sat at a bar. They expected him to perform. They wanted the monkey to dance. And when he glared back at them with the tired eyes of a man trying to pay his rent, they felt cheated. Desperate for work, Carl took whatever scraps the studios threw his way. These were not roles, they were humiliations. He was cast as the annoying teen, the goofy bellhop, the background nuisance. It was a daily exercise in swallowing his pride. He was a professional actor with over a decade of experience, yet he was being paid scale to stand in the back of a shot and look foolish. The definitive moment of this era, and perhaps the most painful meta-commentary on his career, came in Frank Capra's 1946 masterpiece, It's a Wonderful Life. The film is a beloved classic, a celebration of the everyman. But for Carl Switzer, his brief appearance is a study in tragedy. The scene is the high school dance at the gym. The floor is packed with young, beautiful people dancing the Charleston. The stars, Jimmy Stewart and Donna Reed, are the center of attention, radiant with romance and future potential. And there, on the sidelines, is Carl Switzer. He plays Freddie Othello, a mischievous, jealous prankster who holds the key, literally, to the mechanism that opens the floor to reveal the swimming pool beneath. It is a role that exploits his reputation as a troublemaker. He turns the key, the floor opens, and the beautiful people fall into the water. It's a classic gag. The audience laughs. But look closer. Carl is the disruptor, the clown who creates the chaos so that the real characters can have their romantic moment in the pool. He is not part of the love story. He is the obstacle. He is the mechanic of someone else's narrative. When the camera cuts away, nobody cares what happens to Freddie. He disappears back into the crowd, just an instrument of the plot. For Carl, filming that scene must have been a bitter pill. He was standing feet away from Jimmy Stewart, a man who was allowed to be a hero, to be complex, to be loved. Carl was just the guy with the key. The paycheck for that day's work likely went to paying off debts or buying a round of drinks to numb the realization that this was as good as it was going to get. He was witnessing the American dream from the wrong side of the glass. As the late 1940s bled into the 1950s, even these small roles began to evaporate. The Alfalfa novelty was wearing thin. A new generation of child stars was rising. Fresh faces for the machine to chew on? Carl Switzer was becoming obsolete. To survive, he had to debase himself in ways that broke his spirit. He took jobs that were far beneath his skill set, but necessary for his survival. He worked as a bartender, pouring drinks for men who recognized him and made jokes about his singing. He worked as a used car salesman, using his fading celebrity to close deals on beat-up sedans. Buy a car from Alfalfa was a pitch that reeked of desperation. But the job that he gravitated toward most was that of a hunting guide. It made sense. In the mountains, away from the studio lots and the autograph seekers, he could pretend to be someone else. He could be Carl Switzer, the outdoorsman, the sharpshooter, the man who could track a bear and handle a rifle. It was a masculine, rugged identity that stood in direct opposition to the sissy image of Alfalfa. In the wilderness, the bears didn't care about his cowlick. The silence of the forest was a relief from the noise of his own failure. He moved to a small farm in the San Fernando Valley, trying to build a life that looked normal. He married a woman named Diane Collingwood in 1954. They had a son. For a brief moment, it seemed like he might find stability. He was trying to be a husband, a father, a provider. But the demons were always there, scratching at the door. The drinking didn't stop. The anger didn't subside. The marriage crumbled after only 3 years. Diane left, taking the child, unable to cope with a man who was constantly warring with his own past. By 1958, Carl was alone again, living in a rented house, scraping by on the meager income from guiding hunting trips and training dogs. He was 31 years old, but he looked older. His face was puffy from alcohol, his eyes shadowed with fatigue. The industry had moved on completely. The Little Rascals was now being packaged for television syndication, broadcast into millions of living rooms every afternoon. A whole new generation of children was laughing at Alfalfa. The studios were making money hand over fist from these reruns. And Carl, he got nothing, not a dime. The contracts he had signed as a child didn't include residuals for television, a technology that barely existed when he was a star. Every time his face appeared on TV, someone else got paid. It was a theft that happened daily, a recurring reminder of his exploitation. He would sit in bars, seeing himself on the television set in the corner, knowing that the image on the screen was generating wealth that he would never touch. It drove him mad. It fueled a righteous, burning paranoia. He felt that the world owed him. This sense of being cheated seeped into his daily interactions. He became litigious, petty, and quick to take offense. He was fighting for scraps now. He started hanging around the edges of criminal elements, not as a gangster, but as a hanger-on, a tough guy by association. He was arrested for cutting down trees in a state park, a bizarre, petty crime that spoke to his aimlessness. He was drifting, a ship without an anchor, heading toward the rocks. His descent wasn't glamorous. It wasn't the romanticized self-destruction of a rock star. It was the gritty, slow-motion collapse of a man who has run out of options. He was the eternal extra, the man who was always in the background of life, watching others succeed. And like any man who has been pushed to the margins for too long, he began to push back. He decided that he wouldn't be ignored anymore. If the world wouldn't give him respect, he would take it. If they wouldn't pay him what he was worth, he would collect what he was owed, down to the last dollar. It was this mindset, the mindset of a man who feels the world is in his debt, that led him to accept a job training a hunting dog for a man named Moses Stilts. It was a simple transaction, a few months of work, a few $100s. It should have been easy, but for Carl Switzer, nothing was easy anymore. Every interaction was a battleground for his dignity, and this particular transaction over a dog that liked to run away would become the final act of his tragedy. The stage was set, the players were in place, the gun was loaded. All that was needed was a spark. And in the dry, desperate tinderbox of Carl Switzer's life, a spark was inevita. By January 1959, Carl Switzer was living on the razor's edge of poverty. The glamour of Hollywood was a distant memory, replaced by the harsh reality of the San Fernando Valley. He was renting a room, driving a beat-up car, and hustling for every dollar. His primary source of income was no longer his face or his voice, but his ability to handle animals. He had become a dog trainer, a job that required patience, a virtue he was rapidly losing. The catalyst for his death was absurdly trivial. It wasn't a rivalry over a woman, a drug deal gone bad, or a high-stakes gambling debt. It was a treeing Walker coonhound. Carl had agreed to train the dog for a man named Moses Bud Stilts, a welder and occasional business partner. Stilts was a tough character, a man who worked with his hands and didn't suffer fools. The arrangement was simple. Carl would train the dog to hunt bears, and Stilts would pay him. But during a training run in the rugged terrain near Big Bear Lake, the dog broke loose. It vanished into the wilderness. For Carl, this was a catastrophe. Losing a client's dog was unprofessional, but more importantly, it meant he wouldn't get paid. Desperate, he put up flyers, contacted the police, and offered a reward. Days later, a rancher found the dog wandering miles away. Carl drove out to retrieve the animal, paying the rancher a $35 reward from his own pocket. In a gesture of relief and gratitude, or perhaps just the compulsive generosity of a man who needed to be liked, he also bought the rancher $15 worth of drinks at a local bar. The total cost to Carl Switzer, $50. In 1959, $50 was a significant sum. It was the equivalent of about $500 today. For a man in Carl's financial position, it was a fortune. It was rent, it was groceries, it was survival. When he returned the dog to Stilts, he expected reimbursement. In Carl's mind, the logic was irrefutable. I spent my money to save your property. You owe me that money back. But Stilts saw it differently. He hadn't authorized the reward. He hadn't authorized the drinks. He refused to pay. The refusal gnawed at Carl. It wasn't just about the money, it was about the disrespect. It was another instance of the world taking from him and giving nothing back. He stewed on it for days. He drank on it. The more he drank, the more the $50 transformed from a debt into a symbol of every wrong that had ever been done to him. It became the residuals he never got. It became the roles he never landed. It became the respect he never earned. On the evening of January 21st, 1959, the dam broke. Carl was drinking with a friend, Jack Piot, a 37-year-old unit still photographer who was equally down on his luck. Fueled by alcohol and righteous indignation, Carl decided it was time to collect. "We're going to get that money," he told Piot. They drove to Stilts' home in Mission Hills. It was a dark, cool night. The suburban street was quiet, unaware that a tragedy was pulling into the driveway. When they arrived, Stilts was home with his wife and stepchildren. He opened the door to find two angry, intoxicated men on his porch. Carl didn't waste time with pleasantries. He demanded the $50. Stilts told him to go to hell. The argument moved inside. The air in the small living room grew thick with testosterone and menace. According to the testimony given at the inquest, the verbal altercation quickly turned physical. Stilts claimed that Carl, eyes wild with rage, grabbed a glass dome clock from the mantelpiece and struck him over the head. The glass shattered. Blood poured down Stilts' face, blinding him in one eye. The violence had escalated from shouting to bloodshed in seconds. Stilts, terrified and bleeding, scrambled away. He ran into his bedroom. When he emerged moments later, the balance of power had shifted terrifyingly. He was gripping a .38 caliber revolver. This was the climax of Carl Switzer's life script, but there was no director to yell "cut." There was only a bleeding man with a gun and a desperate ex-actor with a bruised ego. Stilts pointed the weapon at the two intruders. He yelled at them to get out, but Carl didn't leave. Whether it was the alcohol, the arrogance of a man who had once been invincible, or a suicidal recklessness, he didn't back down. According to Stilts' account, Carl grabbed the gun barrel. A struggle ensued. The gun went off, firing a round into the ceiling. The sound of the gunshot should have been the end of it. It should have been the moment everyone froze. But it only accelerated the chaos. Stilts claimed that after the warning shot, Carl pulled a switchblade knife from his pocket. He claimed Carl crouched into a fighter's stance, his face contorted with hate, and screamed, "I'm going to kill you." Stilts fired again. This time he didn't aim for the ceiling. The bullet struck Carl in the groin. It was a devastating, ugly wound. The projectile severed the femoral artery and tore through his intestines. The impact lifted the 31-year-old off his feet. He slammed back against the wall and then slid down to the floor. There were no famous last words. There was no cinematic speech. Carl looked at his stomach, then at Stilts, with an expression of profound shock. He groaned. His hands, the hands that had once signed autographs for thousands of cheering fans, now clutched at a hole in his gut, trying in vain to hold his life inside. Jack Piot, witnessing his friend's execution, allegedly dove behind a piece of furniture as Stilts kept the gun trained on the room, shouting that he had been defending his life. The Stilts family called the police. When the ambulance arrived, Carl Switzer was unconscious. The blood loss was catastrophic. He died on the way to the hospital. He was pronounced dead on arrival, DOA, just another casualty of a violent night in Los Angeles. The aftermath was swift and cold. The police arrived at the Stilts' home and found a small penknife under Carl's body. It was closed. This detail would haunt the case for years. If Carl had pulled a knife, why was it closed? Was it planted, or had he never even opened it? But the coroner's jury was not interested in these nuances. They saw a bleeding homeowner, a dead intruder with a reputation for trouble, and a shattered clock. On January 26, 1959, the jury ruled the shooting justifiable homicide. Moses Stilts walked out of the courthouse a free man. The case of the death of Alfalfa was closed. But the final insult, the one that truly sealed his tragic fate, came from the media. Carl Switzer died on January 21st, 1959. On that very same day, Hollywood lost a giant, Cecil B. DeMille. The legendary director of The Ten Commandments died of heart failure. DeMille was the establishment. He was the pillar of the industry. The next morning, the newspapers were filled with eulogies for DeMille. His death was front-page news across the globe. The death of Carl Switzer was buried in the back pages. A few inches of column space squeezed between advertisements and minor crime reports. Ex-child star killed in dog dispute. The contrast was absolute. DeMille died a king, Switzer died a nuisance. The industry that Switzer had helped build with his childhood labor didn't even pause to mourn him. There were no tributes from the studios, no moment of silence on the sets. He was just gone. His funeral was held at the Hollywood Forever Cemetery, but it was a modest affair. There were no crowds of weeping fans. No honorary Oscars were placed on his coffin. He was buried in a simple grave, a stone's throw from the Paramount and RKO studios, where he had once been a star. The inscription on his headstone did not mention Alfalfa. It didn't mention the laughter he had given the world. It simply listed his name, his dates, and a Masonic symbol. For decades, his grave went largely unvisited. While tourists flocked to see the resting places of Rudolph Valentino and Douglas Fairbanks, Carl Switzer lay in obscurity. It was as if the world wanted to forget him, to erase the uncomfortable truth of his existence. He was the dark mirror of the Hollywood dream, the proof that the system could take a beautiful, talented child and chew him up until there was nothing left but a corpse on a linoleum floor. The $50 was never paid. The debt remained unsettled. But Carl Switzer had paid the ultimate price. He had given his life for a principle that nobody else cared about. He died as he had lived in his later years, fighting for respect in a world that saw him only as a joke. The bullet that killed Carl Switzer didn't just end a life. It exposed the rotting underbelly of an entire industry. When the coroner's van drove away from Mission Hills that night, it carried more than just a body. It carried the first undeniable proof that Hollywood's relationship with children was predatory, toxic, and ultimately lethal. For years, the public had been sold a lie. They believed that the children on screen were as happy as the characters they played. They believed that the little rascals lived in a perpetual state of innocent mischief. Carl Switzer's bloody end shattered that illusion, though few at the time were willing to look at the shards. He was the first canary to die in the coal mine, long before the tragic deaths of Anissa Jones, Dana Plato, or River Phoenix forced the world to pay attention. The immediate aftermath of his death was a masterclass in collective amnesia. The studios did what they do best. They moved on. The Little Rascals continued to air on television, generating millions in ad revenue. The laughter track played on, ghost voices chuckling at the antics of a boy who was now decomposing in the ground. The disconnect was grotesque. Children in the 1960s and 70s ate their breakfast cereal watching Alfalfa croon to Darla, completely unaware that the actor had died in a violent brawl over pocket change. But the silence around his death speaks louder than any eulogy. Why was there no outcry? Why was there no investigation into the labor practices that left a millionaire child star destitute at 31? The answer lies in the legal and moral vacuum of the era. When Carl was working, the Coogan Law, passed in 1939 to protect child actors' earnings, was still a toothless tiger. It had loopholes wide enough to drive a studio truck through. It allowed parents to claim huge percentages of a child's income for upkeep and management. It allowed studios to pay children a fraction of what they paid adults, arguing that they were gaining experience. By the time Carl reached adulthood, the fortune he had supposedly earned was largely a fiction. He had been an employee, not an owner, of his own image. Moreover, there was no concept of psychological support. Today we understand the trauma of terminal childhood, the psychological damage inflicted when a person is frozen in the public imagination at a specific age. We have therapists who specialize in the unique neuroses of fame. In 1959, the solution was a stiff drink and a command to man up. Carl Switzer was left to navigate the transition from beloved icon to washed-up has-been with zero emotional tools. The rage that defined his final years, the bar fights, the petty crimes, the paranoia was not just bad character, it was a symptom of untreated trauma. He was acting out the grief of a stolen life. His death also highlights the cruelty of the residual system. Residuals are payments made to actors when their work is rebroadcast. They are the pension plan of the actor. But in the 1930s and 40s, television was a science fiction concept. Contracts didn't account for it. When the Little Rascals became a staple of TV programming, the money flowed exclusively to the copyright holders. The actors got nothing. Imagine the psychological torture of being Carl Switzer in 1955. You are broke. You are working as a bartender. And on the TV set above the bar, your face is appearing. The patrons look up and laugh. The owner of the station gets paid. The advertiser gets paid. The studio executives get paid, and you get asked to wipe down the counter. It is a form of theft that is legal, ongoing, and deeply personal. It is no wonder he felt the world owed him $50. In his mind, the world owed him millions. The curse of the Little Rascals became a popular tabloid trope in later years, citing the premature deaths of Alfalfa, Buckwheat, and Darla Hood. People love to attribute these tragedies to supernatural bad luck. It makes for a spooky story, but the truth is far more mundane and far more horrifying. There was no curse. There was only exploitation. These children were worked like adults, deprived of education and socialization, and then discarded like broken toys when they hit puberty. The curse was capitalism without conscience. In 2000, a new witness stepped forward to shed light on the night of the shooting, adding a final layer of ambiguity to the tragedy. Tom Corrigan, the stepson of Moses Stilts, claimed he was present in the house that night. In an interview, he alleged that the shooting was more execution than self-defense. He claimed that after Stilts shot Switzer, Switzer didn't die immediately. He claimed his stepfather left the actor bleeding on the floor, and that he, a child at the time, was the only one who tried to help. He also cast doubt on the knife, suggesting it might have been staged. Corrigan's testimony, coming decades too late, couldn't change the legal verdict. Moses Stiltz had died in 1983, but it reinforced the sense that Carl Switzer had been failed by everyone, by the man who shot him, by the police who investigated him, and by the history books that forgot him. Today, Carl Switzer's grave at Hollywood Forever has become a minor pilgrimage site for those who know the story. Visitors leave coins on his headstone, pennies, nickels, sometimes a $50 bill, a symbolic repayment of the debt that killed him. It is a gesture of apology from a public that consumed his life and gave nothing back. But the real monument to Carl Switzer isn't in the cemetery. It is in the caution tape that now surrounds child stardom. His life and his wretched death serve as a grim warning label on the bottle of fame. He proved that being loved by millions is not the same as being loved. He proved that you can be the most famous face in the world and still die alone on a dirty floor, fighting for the price of a few bags of groceries. As we move to the conclusion of this dark tale, we must ask ourselves, what is the price of a laugh? When we enjoy the antics of a child on screen, are we watching a performance or are we witnessing a theft? Carl Switzer gave us his childhood. In return, we gave him a legacy of silence. It was a bad trade, and the receipt is still stained with blood. When we look back at the wreckage of Carl Switzer's life, it is tempting to view it as a singular stroke of bad luck, a volatile man, a hot-headed opponent, a tragic misunderstanding. But that view is too narrow. It absolves the true culprit. The finger that pulled the trigger belonged to Moses Stiltz, but the architect of Carl's destruction was Hollywood itself. Carl Switzer was not just a murder victim. He was the casualty of a slave contract that bound him to a system designed to extract value and discard the husk. In the archives of film history, the contracts signed by child stars of the 1930s read like indentured servitude. They were legal instruments of exploitation. A child like Carl was paid a salary, often a generous one, by the standards of the Depression, but he owned nothing. He did not own his image. He did not own his voice. He did not own the copyright to the character he created. When he signed his name, he was signing away his future. The most damning aspect of this arrangement was the complete lack of residuals. This is the financial gun that was held to his head decades later. The Little Rascals is one of the most durable products in entertainment history. It has never gone out of print. It ran on television constantly from the 1950s through the 1990s. It was released on VHS, then DVD, then streaming. It has generated hundreds of millions of dollars in pure profit. And Carl Switzer, the boy whose face is the franchise, he died fighting over $50 because he didn't have $50 to lose. If Carl had received even a fraction of a penny for every time The Little Rascals aired on television in 1958, he would have been a wealthy man. He would not have been training hunting dogs to pay his rent. He would not have been dependent on the charity of strangers. He would not have been desperate enough to kick down a door in Mission Hills. The $50 debt was a symptom of a disease, the disease of an industry that eats its young. This is the final insult that hangs over his grave. The laughter that we hear when we watch those old clips is the sound of his labor, echoing through time, generating wealth for corporations that wouldn't pay for his funeral. He is a ghost employee working forever, unpaid, from beyond the grave. The tragedy of Alfalfa is the tragedy of American nostalgia. We love the product, but we are indifferent to the worker. We want the innocence of the cowlick and the off-key singing, but we don't want to know about the alcoholism, the poverty, and the bullet wound. We want the fairy tale without the grim ending, but the ending exists, and it is brutal. On the day he died, January 21st, 1959, the world mourned Cecil B. DeMille. DeMille was the architect of dreams, the man who parted the Red Sea on screen. He represented the majesty of Hollywood. Carl Switzer represented its reality. He was the disposable fuel that kept the dream machine running. DeMille got the headlines. Switzer got the coroner's van. It was a final poetic injustice that perfectly summarized his place in the pecking order. Decades have passed since that gunshot rang out in the San Fernando Valley. The house in Mission Hills is still there, just another bungalow in a sprawling city. The grave at Hollywood Forever has weathered, the stone settling into the earth. But the question remains, haunting and insistent. What is the cost of a childhood? We look at modern child stars, the Britneys, the Justins, the Macaulays, and we see the same patterns repeating, the same desperate struggle to survive the transition from object to subject. We see the addiction, the public meltdowns, the premature deaths, and we shake our heads and say, what a shame. We rarely stop to ask if we are the ones consuming them. Carl Switzer's life poses a terrifying what if. What if the laws had been different? What if he had received just 1% of the royalties from his work? He would likely have lived to be an old man. He might have opened a hunting lodge, raised his son, and watched his old movies with a sense of pride rather than bitterness. The $50 dispute would have been a minor annoyance, not a fatal confrontation. He died for the price of a dinner. But the check he picked up was one that belonged to all of us. He paid for our entertainment with his sanity and eventually with his life. The next time you see the boy with the freckles and the pointy hair standing on a black and white screen, singing his heart out in a voice that breaks on every high note, don't just laugh. Look at his eyes. Look at the energy he is pouring into that performance. And remember that the boy you are watching is doomed. Remember that he is singing for his supper, and that when the song ends, the lights will go out, and he will be left alone in the dark, waiting for a paycheck that will never come. Alfalfa is immortal. Carl Switzer is dead. And in Hollywood, that is the only deal on the table.